What a great morning. Ofroth and the two B'nai Mitzvah, and there's so much to celebrate. Have any of you ever been to Middleton, Massachusetts? Nope, I've not been there either. The town was founded in 1728. So the town is 48 years older than the United States. 1728. It has a population of about 10,000 people today. At least that's what Google says. And it's tucked between Andover and Salem, Massachusetts is where it is, a beautiful part of the state. And on the town's website, the town clerk wrote a blog post called "The Power of One Vote." It's a list of elections that were won or lost by the narrowest of margins. So for example, did you know that in 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected president by one vote in the House of Representatives after a tie in the Electoral College? I'm sure some of you did. This is like, I'm a fellow dork with you. In 1824, Andrew Jackson won the presidential popular vote, but lost by one vote in the House of Representatives to John Quincy Adams after an electoral college deadlock. And in 1845, the U.S. Senate passed the convention annexing Texas by 2 votes. So if it wasn't for those 2 votes, we wouldn't have Texas. It would have, which just means that we would have changed the World Series. That's all. But more recently, in 1994, the Republican Randall Luthi and independent Larry Cowell tied for a seat in the Wyoming House of Representatives from the Jackson Hole area with 1,941 votes each. A recount produced the same results. And Mr. Luthi was finally declared the winner when, in a drawing before the state canvassing board, do you know how this was done? A ping pong was drawn. There was 2 ping pongs. Their names were written on it. And someone pulled his name out, and that's how he won. So similar to flipping a coin. And in 2000, of course, the presidential election was decided by an extremely narrow margin, with George W. Bush won the state of Florida by just 537 votes, making him the next president of the United States. But close to 6 million voters went to the polls in Florida, and extrapolating even more, how many people in America voted, and it came down to just 537 votes. And of course, locally, we all know of the past 2 elections for our county executive. The vote and the recount separated Mark Elrich with David Blair down to just a few dozen votes. So voting matters, and every vote matters. It is the greatest obligation of a citizenry in a democracy. And next week holds 2 events which are laid next to each other on the calendar, and I believe act as an important reminder. You see, the consequences of elections are sometimes subtle and other times more stark. Academics like to look for trends by tracking past elections on federal, state, and local levels, and to see how they are reflections of satisfactions or discontent, worries or affirmations. How are they an expression of priorities? So let me be clear, I'm not speaking in hyperbole. And what I'm about to say is not throwing up my hands to God and declaring that all is lost, that the opposite is true. What I am about to say is that we cannot take for granted that rights will be protected any longer, that the assumption of the infallibility of Emma Lazarus's 1883 poem of the Statue of Liberty may no longer be true. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tote to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. That we realize elections have consequences and that our democracy has never been more polarized or fragile in my lifetime than at this moment. So November 9th is next Wednesday. And while it is the day after Election Day, Tuesday, November 8th, Wednesday is also the 84th anniversary of Kristallnacht. Your younger friends here who may not know what Kristallnacht is, it is known as the Night of Broken Glass. And the concentration camp of Auschwitz, just for perspective, was opened in 1940. So this is about 2 years earlier than Auschwitz opened as a concentration camp. But it set the stage for the horrors to come. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum posts this about Kristallnacht. On the night of November 9th, 1938, violent anti-Jewish demonstrations broke out across Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. Nazi officials depicted the riots as justified reactions to the assassination of German foreign official Ernst von Rath, who had been shot 2 days earlier by Herschel Greenspan, a 17-year-old Polish Jew distraught over the deportation of his family from Germany. Let me just pause there. That by this time, political violence was already known. We just have to read the headlines to see that political violence is already common today. Just last week in San Francisco, just not too long ago, a few miles downtown on January 6th. After the next 48 hours, violent mobs spurred by anti-Semitic exhortations from Nazi officials destroyed hundreds of synagogues, burning or desecrating Jewish religious artifacts along the way. Acting on orders from the Gestapo headquarters, police officers and firefighters did nothing to prevent the destruction. All told, approximately 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses, homes, and schools were plundered. 91 Jews were murdered. An additional 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Nazi officials immediately claimed that the Jews themselves were to blame for the riots, and a fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks, which was about $400 million in 1938 money. So quick calculation puts that at that the Jewish community, the victims of Kristallnacht, were fined $8.4 billion by today's standards. The $8.4 billion equivalent was imposed on the German Jewish community. The Nazis came to call the event Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, or the Night of Broken Glass, referring to the thousands of shattered windows that littered the streets afterwards. But the euphemism does not convey the full brutality of the event. Kristallnacht was a turning point in the history of the Third Reich, marking the shift from anti-Semitic rhetoric and legislation to violent, aggressive, anti-Jewish measures that would culminate with the Holocaust. Kristallnacht was a tipping point in many ways, but it was the result of years of society shifting and accepting the previously unacceptable, of allowing elections to express the lowest hopes rather than our highest ideals. To understand what I mean, we need to back up a few years. It was November of 1932 that the Nazi Party was elected into power. 4 months later, Nazi power lawfully acquired full power in the parliament. 9 months later, November of 1933, the Nazi Party won the entire parliament because by then all opposition parties had been banned. The Guardian newspaper reported on the German elections in their November 13th, 1933 edition, and this is part of that newspaper clipping. The results of the German referendum and elections to the Reichstag yesterday show, as was expected, an overwhelming majority for Herr Hitler. A less expected result of the elections is the number of Germans who have dared to vote against Herr Hitler's policy. The electors were asked to say in the referendum whether they approved of Herr Hitler's decision that Germany should leave the League of Nations and the Disarmament Conference. And in the elections to the Reichstag, they were simply asked to vote for the Nazi list. As I said, there were no other candidates. But the article gives some voting details. Nazis won by 92.2% of the vote, and the only other option was invalid votes, were 7.8% of the vote. As I continue with the Guardian report, hear how votes are made invalid and the election has become wholly manipulated into a farce. And maybe there's some resonance to today. The 1933 article continues, on the new methods used by the Nazis in the elections was a rigorous house-to-house call during the day to ascertain whether the occupants had voted. The same reason was given throughout Germany. We do this because Germany's right to exist is now a question of to be or not to be, they quoted. In the Sturm district of East Prussia, where the inhabitants are mostly of Polish extraction, the referendum vote was nearly 100% against the government's policy, whilst the votes in the election were all made invalid. At the Jewish hospital in Berlin, the article continues, 120 Reichstag votes were cast. 70 of them were for the Nazi list, while 50 were invalid. In the referendum, 122 votes were cast, of which 101 were yes, and the no's were none, 9 were invalid. The first official result came from a town of Neuss, where 36,000 votes were cast in the Reichstag election. That's 98% somehow. They all voted in favor of this. Of that, almost all of them were for the Nazi Party. This would indicate that as compared with the last election, nearly 20,000 supporters of the other parties had somehow been channeled into the Nazi vote. And at the concentration camp of Osthofen near Frankfurt, of the 88 inmates entitled to vote, which is interesting that this is early enough in Germany that they're still voting in a concentration camp. Clearly they see themselves, the prisoners, if you will, are still somehow considered German citizens because this is in the early 30s. Of the 88 inmates entitled to vote, 79 voted yes for the Nazi Party from within the concentration camp and also on the referendum. And at the Brandenburg concentration camp, out of 1,100 votes in the election, the majority were for the Nazi Party, and the article goes on. And it continues, an amnesty for political prisoners is regarded as probable, the Guardian says, in a hopeful spin, not knowing what's to come. An amnesty for political prisoners is regarded as probable in view of the splendid demonstration of faith in Hitler. So the German votes of 1932 and 33 allowed laws to pass restricting rights and legalizing hate and objectifying and the objectification of fellow German citizens, all legal, or at least through the legal channels. Through the legislative process, the unlawful and immoral became legal. James Q. Whitman's book, Hitler's American Model, details how the Nazis came to the United States to learn from our laws of Jim Crow and more to shape their own processes of legalized dystopias. In Ira Katzelson's review of the book in 2017 in The Atlantic, he writes, Nuremberg was the setting for the September 1935 Party Rally of Freedom, at which a special session of the Reichstag passed by acclamation the legislation that disqualified Jews as Reich citizens with political rights, forbade them to marry or have sex with persons identified as racial Germans, and prohibited any display by Jews of national colors or the national flag, a banner with a swastika. Just 8 days after the Reich citizenship law and the laws of the protection of German blood and German honor and the Reich flag law were formally proclaimed by Adolf Hitler, 45 Nazi lawyers sailed to New York under the auspices of the Association of National Socialist German Jurists. The trip was a reward for the lawyers who had codified the Reich's race-based legal philosophy. Katzelson continues, every day brings fresh reminders that liberal and illiberal democracy can entwine uncomfortably. A timely context for James Q. W. Whitman's Hitler's America Model, which examines how the Third Reich found sustenance for its race-based initiatives in American law. Upon docking, the Germans attended a reception organized by the New York City Bar Association. Everyone in the room would have known about the recent events in Nuremberg, yet the quest by leading Nazi jurists to learn from the American legal and economic systems was warmly welcomed. Whitman, a professor at Yale Law School, wanted to know how the United States, a country grounded in such liberal principles as individual rights and the rule of law, could have produced legal ideas and practices that seemed intriguing and attractive to the Nazis. In exploring this apparent incongruity, his short book raises important questions about law, about political decisions that affect the scope of civic membership, and about the malleability of Enlightenment values. Pushing back against scholarship that downplays the impact in Nazi Germany of the US model of legal racism, Whitman marshals an array of evidence to support the likelihood that the Nuremberg laws themselves reflect direct American influence. So next week, we must bring the experiences of Wednesday into Tuesday. As we enter the voting booths, we must remember that the events of Kristallnacht were influenced by elections that incrementally led to horrors. I'm truly afraid that next week's elections will continue us down a dangerous path, a path of exclusion and division and embracing those espousing hate. But this is not inevitable. I believe we are able to adjust course and vote with our highest ideals, to vote to be our best selves. So this morning, my message is one of caution and optimism. But we must enter next week, next month, next year with both caution and energy to protect our democracy, and optimism that we will learn the lessons of the past, that we will be the golden door that the Statue of Liberty proclaims of us. I believe, as the Yiddish saying says, we are the Goldene Medina, the golden land. Our obligation is to assure that that extends to all of us. Shabbat Shalom.